Hello, folks. I'm assuming everyone can see me okay. Um, Welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Ben Campbell. I'm a clinical psychologist. And we set up this webinar this evening, I suppose, just off the back of some conversations that we had on Twitter, and I suppose some kind of shared interests in different psychological theory and how that applies to experiences of class. I'm just going to share quickly. So, I'm just going to briefly introduce just who we are and what we do. So we are kind of part of a team called ClassClinPsych. We, myself and Will Curvis, kind of started doing these webinars and over a year ago now, which feels really far away. So we've kind of expanded out the team, and we have a few folks all working with us now and all kind of volunteering their time to take part in these conversations. Just some very basic kind of housekeeping. The webinar this evening is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, obviously just keep your microphone and your video off. While the speakers are doing their thing, if you don't mind, just mute your microphone and keep your video off, because we have so many people on the call this evening. As we all know, Teams can be a bit finicky, so it's good just to kind of keep it keep the load down. What we're going to do is get used to use the chat function. So while people are speaking, if you have a question, if there's something you'd like to know, or just any reflections, feel free to pop it in the chat. Celine, who is part of the team, I don't know if she is able to come on quickly. I don't know. So Celine's part of, oh, there she is. So Celine's part of the ClassClin team. She's going to keep a wee eye on the chat and just kind of feed back any questions or thoughts or whatever. But there will also be time for you to do that yourselves at the end of each speaker section. We're also using, we're having a go at using Padlet tonight as part of the webinar. We've not done it before in this format. So you can, Padlet's kind of like an online whiteboard, so you can use that as well as using the chat function if you like. If there's stuff that is I don't know, anything that's linked to the conversation that's happening, anything that you think would be useful to add in, you can add it onto the Padlet, so everyone can kind of crowdsource, at the discussion. And then at the end of the webinar, we can export that as a PDF and then make that available to people. So if you feel like doing that, that is fine. It's available. You don't need to download an app or anything, like it's just on the internet. So if you have a camera on your phone or anything, you can use the QR code here, but we'll also put a link to it in the chat as well. We're also on Twitter. I mean, I imagine most of you have probably found us through Twitter. We use Twitter an awful lot because we don't have any money, and everyone just kind of volunteers their time. So there's links there to a lot of our past work, to our past webinars, which are all on YouTube for free, and like a few handy kind of resources and links to other good people and other bits and bobs. Oh yeah, I'll not go to that just yet. So without further ado, I think we'll start off. So I think our first speaker is Connor O'Brien, and he has a wee bit of a presentation as well. So Connor, if you just want to introduce yourself and give us a wee bit of an idea about who you are and where you're from, and then we'll go from there. Is that okay?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Connor. I'm now a clinical psychologist as of today. And that's the first time I've introduced myself as that. It feels a bit weird. But I've trained at Exeter University, and I've just gotten a job in Devon Partnership Trust, working in the secure forensic inpatient directorate. And my main interests are obviously to do, thank you in the chat, my main interests are to do with obviously class and clinical psychology, and kind of just opening the conversation about it really, and linking it back to how it can support the people we see and work with as well. And another interest of mine is looking at sort of more community-based perspectives of clinical psychology. And one of the things that that I was going to talk about today was the power threat meaning framework, and how that's related to class and clinical psychology as well. So I've done a bit of a nerdy thing and made a slideshow presentation, mainly because I think it's easiest to convey some of the sort of points I'm going to be talking about today. But also as it might be useful for those of you who are aspiring psychologists who might want to kind of learn a bit more about the power threat meaning framework as well, and how that is applied within the NHS. I'm sure many of you know about it anyway, so I'm not going to teach people to suck eggs, but it'd be useful to for people to have a think and reflect, if it's safe to do so, on how this might relate to yourself as well, as we go through. So I'm just going to share my screen. This could go one of two ways. Can anyone give me a thumbs up just to make sure that I know that this has been shared properly?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, bear with me a second. So I've got to make sure I can see what I want to see now. Okay. Sorry, bear with me. It's not giving me my view. Okay, so first I'm going to give a little bit of context around obviously what the power threat meaning framework is and how it fits into the NHS or into sort of wider psychology as practice. So the power threat meaning framework, as described by Dr. Lucy Johnston, so one of the authors of it alongside Professor Mary Boyle, is the power threat meaning framework can be used as a way of helping people to create more hopeful narratives or stories about their lives and the difficulties they faced or are still facing, instead of seeing themselves as blameworthy, weak, deficient, or mentally ill. Now, many of you who either follow Lucy Johnston on Twitter or know of her will know that she's no stranger to quite confrontational language in the way that she conveys the power threat meaning framework. And I think that's a good thing in many ways, because it's a narrative that we're trying to sort of, cement more in psychology. And I think it's really important to do that. But also, what I'm also aware of is that many of us as psychologists as well will come from very different sort of backgrounds in terms of how we view mental health and the way we approach it in our practice. And also there are psychiatrists, nurses, any other background that you might come from, where you might have learned to look at things through a very different lens. So I'm going to be very cautious of that today, but also make sure that I look at this through the lens of a psychologist as well. Because if we look at things in the NHS and how they're currently structured, to the right, you'll see the typical sort of medicalised model of looking at distress or mental health, where a good example of a quote would be, mental health, like most illnesses, can be categorised based on common characteristics. This is where we see things like obviously diagnoses and being able to sort of run services using certain criteria that are met in order to make sure we take people on to treat them. And then there's the other side, which is the power threat meaning side, the distress models, where in some extreme cases, some people would say there is no such thing as mental health. We're all a product of our experiences. So many of us might sit somewhere along this spectrum, and I don't think it's really a black and white thing, to be honest. But what I've experienced throughout my training and also through my sort of career before training is that typical NHS mental health service models tend to be more towards the medicalised model. And I'm sure many of you could probably agree with that as well. And this naturally lends itself to using language and discussion that will obviously bring into context how we view mental health difficulties. But there's obviously the main problem with polarization is that as somebody who's experienced this myself, and being on the end of this, it can really be at the detriment of services, patients, and also the integrity of professions if we just keep arguing all the time, to the point where we just completely disagree and start calling each other's names and all those kinds of things. So it's important to bear that in mind. So the framework itself, it poses 4 core questions. So the first question is, what has happened to you? So how is power operating in your life? And I'll come on to each of these areas and kind of discuss that further as I go along. The second question is, how did it affect you? So what kind of threats does this pose? The third question is, what sense did you make of it? So what is the meaning of these experiences to you? And fourthly, what did you have to do to survive? So what kinds of threat responses are you using? So with this in mind, this is something that we would usually use to typically approach investigating and ascertaining somebody's distress and what they're experiencing. But we can also use this to apply to how our lives are in general, whether or not we're experiencing distress, and thinking about how we are the way we are. So I think it's a good way of building a narrative and a story around someone's experiences. So starting with power then, so power is an inevitable operator in human life. It's something that we all experience in some ways or another. So we might experience power or powerlessness. And again, it's quite a broad spectrum really, and we might experience power in some ways and powerlessness in other ways. But the main sort of idea about power is that it's being able to influence your surroundings or having control or security and advantage over what you're experiencing. And I'll come on to how this applies to sort of working classness in a bit. But the main sort of operations of power are legal, which is obviously things like having access to sort of legal support and those kinds of things, or maybe thinking about, think about benefits or anything of the like, being able to be represented appropriately within the courts or, within legal matters. Economic and material, so having enough money, having enough security and finances. Interpersonal, so being able to receive or give love or withdraw from love if we want to, and having the ability to make relationships. Coercive and forceful would be things like what we typically attribute to power, so obviously being made to do something, or maybe violence or any of those kinds of things. Biological and embodied power, so that would be things like whether or not you have any health difficulties or disabilities, and also who you are as a person, so attractiveness, height, gender, those kinds of things. Social and cultural, so for example, what you might experience, so there's different things around the UK that might be very different, but also within the context of somebody who is from a subculture in the UK as well. And there's sort of things that you do as a result of your cultural or social upbringing. And then there's ideological power, which is what the main narrative is within the UK, really, in our respect. So, for example, a good one that I like to use is the layers of capitalism. So many of you have probably seen this picture before, whereby there are many layers to our society, and the left one is the sort of original image that was used, say, in the early 1900s. But there's a bit of an application of how that is today on the right, where the working classes are typically seen as the ones who work for all and feed all, and then the middle classes are the ones who also nowadays probably they're working as well, but in jobs that would be typically seen as dependent on the working classes and managing the working classes, and so on and so forth. And all these layers obviously interact with how power operates as well, and how the working classes in particular are held in place in society, which is what I'll come to. Another example of power as well, thinking about the Wheel of Power and Privilege, this is by Sylvia Duckworth. So, many different facets of power exist as well. So we might hold many parts of our identity that are powerful and stop us from experiencing powerlessness. But there are some that might also obviously make us more prone to experiencing powerlessness in other realms as well. So this is something that's obviously talked about quite a lot lately as we work to decolonize, in particular, clinical psychology training, and also increase representation of underrepresented groups. So in terms of threats, so threats, the way that power operates in our lives may cause us to experience different threats. So obviously, if you're experiencing, say, for example, economic powerlessness, so you don't have a lot of money, you're less likely to be able to buy things and, for example, eat healthily. And if you're less likely to eat healthily, you're going to experience some health powerlessness as well. And that can cause many health threats. It can cause interpersonal threats because you're not able to go out and see people and form relationships in the same way. You might also experience other difficulties and threats that come along. And these threats are sort of positioned in a way that they come directly as a sort of scene response, or sorry, a scene example of how power operates. So the power is a sort of more abstract and less sort of visible thing that's held against us, whereas the threats are where we can see it in action, really. So what are the threats being caused by the power? Some primary examples would be sort of threats to relationships, emotional threats, social or community threats, economic and material threats, environmental, bodily, value-based, and meaning-making. So these are all examples of how we might be threatened by these aspects of power. And in terms of the meaning, so we actively, as human beings, we try to make sense of our experiences of threat and then apply meaning to those. And that can often mostly be in terms of the way that we feel in response to these threats. So, for example, if somebody who lost their job, they might feel helpless, or if somebody was disowned by their family, they might feel like they're facing social threat and might feel alienated. So these three sort of aspects, the power, the threat, and the meaning, are all linked in a way whereby they all respond to one another, and it's like a complex web of experiences as a result of essentially what the distress is and as it is being presented. Some good examples of meaning, and you might recognize these mainly as feelings and those kinds of things, but feeling unsafe, abandoned, helpless, rejected, invaded, controlled, alienated, and so on and so forth. So I thought a good example of this, of being able to show this, especially as we're human beings, is we're very complex creatures. We've evolved so that we can feel, and we've evolved so that we can think. And in many ways, this is a gift, because we're obviously probably the most successful species on the planet. Apart from, somebody said wheat was or something like that because it's a crop for some reason. But humans were able to think and feel. And in that sense, we're also cursed, because thinking and feeling can cause us to feel distressed, not only mentally, but physically. And this is why it's important to argue that all of our experiences lead to emotions, lead to thoughts, lead to responses. And that leads to my next point, where we learn to cope and respond to our environment by adapting and surviving, and most of all, keeping safe. So, for example, what might be described in some realms, and some of this language is used in context of NHS services, so help seeking or love seeking, withdrawal and isolation. So these are all the typical responses we might see from people who we're supporting in the NHS and beyond. And these are responses that are built up over time or can be immediate. So a lot of the things that, so for example, somebody might find that if they are constantly, threatened by economic powerlessness, they might respond by doing something like going and, if they find money on the floor, they might take it for themselves, rather than somebody who's never had to face economic hardship might be more likely to give that money and make sure they find the person who dropped it in the first place, and those kinds of things. These are all assumptions, and obviously it's very intercorrelated, and it's a complex web of how we might respond to things. Some primary example threat responses, and many of these you might notice are typical symptoms of some disorders, such as obviously flashbacks would be considered as PTSD related. Restricting eating would be, say, for example, anorexia or bulimia, and rapid changes in mood, those kinds of things. So these are all terms that are used in symptomology, but also used to describe threat responses. So in that respect, it's very, very similar. I've just noticed there's been a bit of a glitch on my computer. Is everyone still with me?
Yep. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Okay. So this is a very extreme example, but for those of you who've seen the film Joker, you might have seen the power, threat, meaning framework in action. So a man who is oppressed by society in many different ways, who faces economic powerlessness, ideological powerlessness, and those kinds of things. He has to fight to survive one day. And I won't give away too much of the story if you haven't seen it. But he ends up forming a new identity based on, obviously, a very fateful response to one situation that has been building up over time, and then there's the breaking point. And I really recommend that you watch it if you haven't already. But if you kind of look at it and enjoy the movie first, because obviously being a psychologist, sometimes you can't enjoy things in the same way. You kind of overanalyze everything and think, how's this got to do with psychology? But the second time around, you know, have a real think about how all this is sort of operating. And it's really interesting to see how well this movie was made in that respect, building Joker's story. So this is how it all comes together in clinical practice. So we link all parts of the power threat meaning framework to make sense of someone's difficulties, which is all well and good, but how does it affect us as clinical psychologists, assistant psychologists, PWPs, CYPWPs, and all that from working class backgrounds? So what can we do to mitigate the impact of power and threats? Because this is all something that comes together and can cause some threat responses. And without trying to sort of pathologize the way that we respond to things, because I think that's a really important sort of thing to consider here. How can we sort of recognize how we're impacted by the power that is in place in clinical psychology? So working classness and power. So working class people are more likely to experience less power than their middle class peers in general. So aside from clinical psychology for a second, this is mainly due to intersections of privilege, but it's also upheld by the way society functions. So 70% of people in charge of this country went to privately educated schools, for example, and that's nowhere near representative of the people of the UK, as we all know. And policies are put in place without the working class lens, really. So it's perpetuating the current middle class, working class, and the upper class divide that exists. And this is the same in clinical psychology in a way, because it's a mainly white middle class profession with many difficulties with hierarchy and overholding power over those who are trying to enter the profession, specifically those from a working class background. So working class people are obviously more likely to face health problems, experience violence, have low resources, be targeted by mainstream media, either in a way that's derogatory towards the working class, as our Prime Minister has himself made very bad comments about how working class people are, but also be from the global majority as well, which adds another sort of facet to the layers of privilege that exist and don't exist for many people. So in terms of clinical psychology as holders of power, obviously we're all very familiar with the problems of applying for a place to train in clinical psychology. It's a difficult enough experience, but the field holds a lot of power and actually uses the application process in a way, whether that's subconsciously or not, to almost sort of create barriers to the working class and other marginalized groups as well. And many of the things that you see here automatically exerts powerlessness upon these individuals. So, for example, the high academic expectations, high experience expectations, high competition for few places, a high focus on teaching westernized and individualistic concepts, and a high status in the NHS. So with all the power that's held by clinical psychology, naturally there are threats. So here's a good example of all the threats aspiring psychs from working class backgrounds are likely to experience. This is a double whammy for those who experience other forms of marginalization as well, such as ethnicity, disability, and of the like. So, for example, working class people are less likely to achieve a 2-1 than their higher socio-economic peers. And I wrote actually an essay on this as part of my professional issues essay, which I'm hoping to kind of disseminate soon. We'll come to that another time. But I also spoke about how we're less likely to be able to gain unpaid or low paid experience. We're less likely to be able to use language used in clinical psychology, like even simple things like, oh, I'm curious, or things like that. And less likely to have experienced individualized issues, more so systemic issues, and also less likely to have friends who hold similar or high status positions. And that's also a difficulty. So how do we tackle this? So I guess as I bring this to a close and open this up to discussion, I think what we're trying to do, many of us who are already trying to sort of push through this difficulty and challenge within clinical psychology, I suppose we're holding universities to account for their expectations. So thinking about grade boundaries, a lot of resistance from the universities in general rather than the clinical psychology training courses, and that's to do with postgraduate entry and academic requirements, but there's still something that is hopefully being pushed through. Mentoring and support, so obviously direct support for aspiring clinical psychologists and the like, in being able to write their applications, and also setting up the idea that all experience is relevant experience, you know, not just the classic AP route, just thinking about other things such as support workers. And when I was a young people's worker, that was some of the best experience I ever had, actually, of being able to work with people. Reaching out at a grassroots level to working class youngsters, so at schools, and those kinds of things. So rather than just kind of catching them at uni when it's already a very difficult experience for them, kind of going below that. And then also creating the space to discuss and reflect, which the ClassClinPsych team are doing an absolutely amazing job of doing. So we're able to kind of discuss these concepts and think about these in a bit more of a deeper way. So I'm aware, I think I'm around 25 minutes in now. I know I've got a bit more time because we don't have one of the talkers, but please stop me at any point, Ben, if I'm stepping a bit over, but now would be a good time for discussion, I suppose, or any questions that anyone might have. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Connor. That was really, really interesting. I think the comment around, like, where does powerlessness operate? You know, where do you find it? And I think there's really clear links in like the pre-qualification experience, you know, of just how competitive it is, I suppose, just to even get on to training, but and more widely in the profession, like within academia and in other professions as well. But I'm also just sort of struck by the, you know, post-qualification, how that kind of powerlessness still can operate, you know, that access to further training and just that kind of, you know, the good quality experience and everything can be really, really tricky as well. It's just something that kind of struck me. And also around how the PTMF maps really well onto the service user experience of, you know, of receiving help, of being a patient. And it's, me and Will have spoken a wee bit before about maybe doing a webinar on like working class service users experiences of services, but there's a lovely dichotomy there, I think, between, you know, what it's like to experience it within the profession, but then what it might be like to experience outside as well. And then the only thing, give us a wee shout whenever you're publishing that essay, because it sounds really interesting. It might be something we could tie up on. I'm wondering if Celine is around. Celine, I'm just wondering, has there been any chat or feedback or anything?
Just putting my camera on. Hi, brilliant presentation, Connor. Really, really interesting. I've not actually heard of the power threat meaning framework before, so very novel for me. I really enjoyed it. There's a few people saying yes, please, to the essay in the chat, and mainly lots and lots of praise for you. So very well done. Yeah, so I just wanted to have a look at the chat once more. So Chloe Slater has said, Ari, your point around the language psychs use, I definitely feel like I switch into a more professional person at work, and this has created issues for me feeling authentic with service users and switching between these unconsciously. So do you think that you found that in your clinical practice that you kind of switched to a more professional, or perhaps more what might look like a middle class person talking?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for that question. Yeah, one of the first things I noticed was when I was in my pediatrics placement, and I was sitting down in the office with everyone, and all the psychologists were in this office as well. And this was one of my first placements on clinical training, and I received a phone call with really, really bad news, and without being too expletive, but one of the first things I came out with was my instant gut reaction, which is where I was speaking to my mum at the time, and when I speak around my mum and with my mum, we we speak very loosely and obviously very differently, and I'm sure that's something that a lot of people here experience as well. Yeah, I said quite a lot of things, and I used a completely different voice to how I'd been as the sort of you know, they'd say, yeah, jump, and I'd say how high kind of trainee who was bright faced, you know, my first placement, thinking, oh, what can I do to impress you? And everyone was like, Connor, I didn't know you spoke like that. You sound like a completely different person. And I think it's something that a lot of people will experience along their journey, and it's a very, very normal experience for people who might obviously not be completely represented in clinical psychology, in the same sense that that's something that I experienced as well. And I think a lot of people think that I've heard comments before like, you know, oh, you don't sound very intelligent, or you don't, I didn't expect you to sound the way you did. And then there's some people who think I should sound like a complete Irishman because of my name. I'm sure Ben would be able to. Yeah. So it's a difficulty that a lot of people face, and a lot of people as well from backgrounds where they might have accents as well. So from different regions of the UK, but also if English isn't your first language, that's another difficulty. And I think there's a lot of focus on being able to be the prim and proper middle class psychologist in order to come across in a certain way. But actually, I've found that dependent on how I read the room, I think with a lot of the people I work with, in particular in forensics, I think it's a lot better for me to speak more authentically and speak in a way that helps them to feel connected, because a lot of them will go, oh, you're not what I expected. And then I'll say, well, exactly, this is a space for us to talk authentically and more properly about your difficulties. And I think they open up a lot more about it. So I guess it's about reading the situation you're in, but I'm one who over time has advocated for being your authentic self wherever you can. And I say that from a position of privilege as a white male, and somebody who can hold, you know, who can probably get away with it in many senses. But also it's something to, you know, consider within the therapy space in particular. I hope I didn't ramble on too much there with my answer, but I hope that answered your question.
No, definitely. And there's quite a few people echoing the feeling of having to tone down a strong regional accent in the comments. And that's something that we definitely came across when we were putting together the position statement many moons ago. There's people saying, sorry that people are so rude as well. I think what you said about like you bringing your authentic accent and there being value in that is really important as well. So the fact that, you know, there is value in a regional accent, for instance, perhaps, you know, you might relate more to service users, or people feel a little bit more comfortable sharing with you. There's also value in that.
Yeah. That there's something I think definitely about representation, you know, just someone hearing a local accent, like local to them, and it maybe not being I don't know, there's an interesting like perception there about whether or not you belong to the system or not, or whose side you're on, you know, when things become a wee bit combative. When I was on a placement in training, a family member of a patient was like, oh, you're Irish. Irish people tarmacked our drive recently or whatever, and made some comment about, you know, the stereotypical Irish travellers tarmacking people's drives. And it was in quite like an accusatory way. And I was like, well, I mean, it wasn't me. It wasn't me that was doing that. But just very, it's interesting, just really, really interesting how, you know, it's England's only a 45-minute flight away, but there's sort of still just that cultural shift coming across. And I know that other Irish people who I trained with had similar kind of experiences just around accent and maybe how we would speak to each other, you know, as friends and as colleagues would be a wee bit different to how other people would speak to each other. But yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think, Edwin, do you have your hand up? I don't know whether that's intentional or not. You're muted, Edwin, if you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. I think the time we're living in now with COVID And there's people commit suicide, and there's people depressed and all sorts of things. I think more psychologists should be involved in churches.
Mm. What would they do you think?
Well, I go to a church in London, and there's a psychologist there.
Okay. I mean, I think there's it's interesting, like some of the work that psychologists are doing, like in community psychology, you know, like actually embedding themselves within communities and making themselves a wee bit more accessible. And I think that's been something that people have definitely talked about before, you know, that psychological services are often hidden behind many kind of layers of access. So it can be a wee bit tricky to actually pin one of us down whenever you do feel like it would be useful to speak to somebody. Thank you, Edwin. So we're just going to go next to, thank you, Connor. First of all, thank you very much. That was really, really useful.
Thank you.
And if we go to Brigitte next, is she here?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hi, yeah, how are you doing? Thank you so much for coming along tonight.
That's okay.
Connor, would you mind, as good as your slides were, would you mind unsharing your screen? Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I think I can probably follow on from some of the issues that cropped up there. So that's nice to be able to do that. So I'm an academic. I work in academia. My focus tonight is on notions of academia and productions of knowledge and how class they are, and what's the kind of what impact does that have on them? What we say, how does that hit and bruise us, basically? And so this is a quite methodological piece of work. Unlike Connor, my slides are going to be a bit academic. I'm sorry for a bit boring, hopefully, but they might be helpful if people want to look at them afterwards. I just felt really academic after those slides, Connor, sorry, God. Hopefully you can bear with me. And so I'm just going to get going now. I'm just going to try sharing me thingy. And then making sure I can see what you can see, and then we should be on. So can you see anything as yet?
Oh, maybe. There we go. That's it.
Are you up?
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. So let me just get what I need up as well, and then we can I can get cracking. Just bear with me. I always have too many windows open when I do this. Okay. So, hi everybody. So as I said, my name's Bridget. I'm an academic. I'm actually head of psychology over at Leeds Beckett University, but my area of expertise and interest is in social class. I take a qualitative perspective, and I'm interested in systems of power and how they reproduce certain ideology and how we make sense of ourselves in the middle of those. So this presentation is called Voicing Resistance to Power. I'll be looking at ways of which we can actually resist that power and ways that we can disrupt that power. And I'll be looking at a piece of research that I did that I feel might allude to that. So this work's also in collaboration with Anna Morris and Lucy Thompson in Michigan State University, just to give some acknowledgements there. Now, so a lot of my research is heavily influenced by feminist traditions within psychology, not necessarily just to look at gender, but to take some of those brilliant traditions that to apply to different systems of difference and systems of inequality. And in this sense, I'm looking at class. And in particular, I'm a discourse analysis. So I'm really interested in how overarching ideas of ideology. So I'm drawing on some of the that feature that Connor talked about. Our ideology really does give rise to power in a particular way, but also disempowers and produces unbelonging as well as belonging. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in what some of those discourses are and the impact on them. And I think they're a crucial method, really, in seeking to understand the way that shared ideology can shore up and reproduce inequalities. And they do so at a macro level, really. If we think about media constructions of the kind of deficient working class mother, for example, or the revolting subject, as Imogen Tyler quite eloquently refers to, this notion, this kind of deficient self that's presented in lots of media coverage, whether it's a TV programme, reality programme, Benefit Street, etc. It doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes and reproduces and causes a system, I think, of oppression. I'm interested in that. So I think discourses do shape and reflect unequal systems, but they also produce and maintain inequalities. So if we think about the good academic, for instance, that's what I'll be looking at shortly, to speak a certain way is bound up in this notion of good academics and good people who can access knowledge and produce knowledge in good ways. But this leads to systemic bias. We can just think of one example, for instance, in recruitment and promotion, where some people who might not speak a particular way may not be recruited. It's clear, the research is clear that that happens repeatedly for people from certain backgrounds, and that's the case for working class backgrounds, certainly. So if we identify ideology that's at play, maybe we can disrupt it and resist classism in the way that we work, and for ourselves as working class people working in very middle class spaces. And maybe we can start to create some kind of resistance against prejudice and discrimination towards social class. The difficulty is, as some of you will know, are familiar with discourse analysis, even vaguely, alone it can be quite problematic when seeking to understand because people's voices and experiences are often lost in the middle of it if we look at big macro things. So we can lose stories of working class people. And these told stories can really lose how we might experience discourse. So how does discourse come inside us and out of us? How does it hit and bruise us? How does it shape our sense of who we are? So to this end, we developed what's called feminist relational discourse analysis. I'll not go too much into this, it's a bit methody really, but it aims to uncover both systems of power, but also voices within that are often unheard. So we were really interested in working class women academic voices in this particular example, but certainly complaint could be applied to many people who are on the other end of systems of oppression and inequality. So the centering of voice within this particular method, I hope, will allow us to really understand spoken accounts of who we are and how these are intimately connected with ideology out there, but also can provide quite big counter narratives to challenge some of those ways of being and ways of speaking. So what I'm hoping to do now is just to present a little bit of data to show you first how this method could be applied to really get at some of the things I'm talking about, but also how the lived experience of some of these ideologies are kind of illuminated through this particular example. So we were interested in working class women in academia. Just a little bit of background. We actually know very little about working class people in academia. We've got by proxy measures that I think Connor referred to in summary statistics, such as postcode data or free school meals data, but they don't capture class or low economic status in any clear or useful way sometimes. So we don't know how many working class people are in academia. We don't know those numbers have increased. We think they have, but we don't know that. We don't know how many were recruited. We don't know what the journeys are like. We don't know how many were retained. We don't know how many are promoted. And this is the case for working class women too. Working class women we know are more underrepresented within academia because of the mid-class male standard. But we don't really understand the mechanics of that. That's really because social class continues to sit outside the protected characteristics that are covered within the Equality Act. So organisations are not required to collect that data. And if, for instance, systematic prejudice is happening at recruitment, the law doesn't really protect us in that, in reference to class in the same way that it would race, for instance, and gender and the other 9 protected characteristics. I'm not banging about that, but I'm part of the campaign to make it 10 and add class as a 10, so because I think it's so important. But thankfully, we've got a lot of qualitative work around working class people's experience in academia. And we know, and this has often been found within feminist psychology, that's looked at working class people's experience within academia. And we know that academic lives are littered with classism and sexism. And different processes of social segregation and seem to enable persistent devaluing and actually sometimes disregard for our bodies, our practices. And equally, our bodies are policed and regulated to fit a particular academic ideal norm. And I think arguably practices serve to exclude and provide division and continue to function to maintain and justify inequalities for working class people in academic settings and beyond. And as quite rightly said, as practicing clinical psychologists, we all need to go through the academic journey and all this impedes on all of us as we move through. I think undoubtedly the qualitative research indicates that unlike the joyous, fruitful journey that's sold to us through meritocratic discourse, that if we try really, really hard and work really hard, we can move from one class setting to another, quite simply. But in fact, that's not the case. It seems that we struggle with feelings of belonging or unbelonging, identity, offensivity, for instance, which will leave us severed perhaps from our working class, our middle class academic colleagues, and also our original sense of being. So we don't have this joyous journey sold to us through meritocracy, I'm afraid. Working class peoples are often in quite fraught situations, and I just wanted to have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So we developed this method as a two-stage process. I'll skip over this a little bit, but the paper's published. If anybody wants to know anything about it, you can get in contact with me. We conducted a piece of research in 15 working class women academics working in all different parts of academia across different institutions. And we established there was a discursive construction of both belonging and a kind of gendered and class self. It was clear that working class women didn't feel like they belong in academia for an whole number of reasons. But what we wanted to do is revisit that data and look to try and identify voiced accounts, how they actually made sense of these ideology, these discourses. How did these discourses go inside them and come back out of them? What feelings were evoked through these discourses? So that's what we set out to do. So it's a two-stage process, really. So we identified the broad discourses in an earlier paper, which is what we call being a fish out of water. So working class women academics is very alienated and deficient in a whole number of ways. And we found that saturated the original data, where women drew upon pathologising discourses of themselves, constructed themselves as deficient, and often this deficient was seen as manifesting from themselves, inside of themselves, either because of an internal psi complex or what we call an imposter syndrome, something wrong inside, for example, or of barriers that they might put up from themselves that are creating othering. So we knew that the class within our data was very much constructed as something that was our fault if we were prejudiced as a result of our class. So we went back in and created some I-poems. Technically, I'll try and not go into too much detail here, but that's where we might get a transcript that pertains to a particular discourse, then pull out I statements and join them up to try and really get at people's lived experience of the discourse. So that's what we did. And what I'm going to do is just present these to you so we can trace voices through discourses. So this is Ellie, and Ellie had been an academic for about 10 years. She worked in different institutions and had all sorts of different struggles, but she was one of the interviews that went on for nearly 4 hours in an hour slot. She had a lot to say. I actually met her again later on. But this is a part of her I-poem around a deficient self, so to speak. So Ellie says, you know, I do feel a bit like a fish out of water. I would say I'm a rarity in a way. I don't think I'd say any of my immediate colleagues have had or had the same background. I find it easier to get on with the support staff. I've had a very different upbringing in life to a lot of people here. I don't know how to talk to you about that. I find professionally no, but because I think I'm respected. But personally, yes, it's a big issue. I still find this could just be me. I still have this barrier. I'm different. To feel like I don't belong in this social group, shall we say. I hate dinner parties. I think there are some of us that do have similar backgrounds, but it's not explicitly discussed. So this is one of the 15 different poems that we've produced. I've just focused on 2 today to try and illustrate how we can really use this to get at the kind of internal struggles and external struggles of the self. So for Ellie then, the discourse of this classed and gendered alien academic self is voiced through expressions that she has the barrier, she's the one creating this. On one hand, she blames herself, it's her that's creating this othered, alienated self. But on the other hand, it's the lack of other working class colleagues. And it's noteworthy that she does feel her academic self is accepted, but personally she isn't. But she feels that's part of her own issues, her own deficient self, and this has led to barriers. So this belonging has been experienced silently. She struggles to voice it. It's not discussed, ensuring that really any solidarity or collective resistance to her is available. This kind of silencing of class, I think, is really picked up again in a lot of our data. I know Derrida called a discourse of silence this explicit discourse that something should be avoided or it should be unavailable or should be limited. We shouldn't speak of things. I think class is similar to that for our participants in academia. And this ensures social class discrimination, making it very difficult to name. This socially produced classism, how can we name it when it's enshrouded with such silence and perhaps even shame, shall we say? So with Ellie, experience is to be voiced as being her and hers to face alone. I've chosen a poem that I think juxtaposes quite nicely with that, so you can get a sense of what some of the things that we've found and some of the interesting issues around belonging for working class academics. This is Therese. So she says, I feel like you've got to fight that little bit harder to be seen as intelligent. I don't think I necessarily sound intelligent. I've just read so many of you saying that in the comments, and I just thought about this, Therese's high point. What I'm saying might sound intelligent, but the way I say it might not be the most eloquent way. I perceive I've got to do that's like some kind of idea of imposter syndrome. I would never hide, although I did when I was younger. I used to not tell people. I used to lie about what mum and dad did when I was younger because I used to feel a bit embarrassed, but that's just a bit silly. I tried to hide myself, but then I've tried to sort of be myself, you know, clothes that you wear and how you present yourself. I mean, I could spend a lot of time on this poem of Therese's. I'm sure some of us can. It's in a very in-depth expression of her experience of othering. But Therese, for a class, is something of a disclosure, something that's personal, perhaps even shameful, and may invite othering and stigma. I think a personal voice experience illustrates how this politics of belonging draws on a kind of deficient or sufficient self, and it creates personal experiences on belonging for our participants. This discourse is experienced as shameful, a class self is to be hidden, also but also continually contested. She's caught because of early experience of hiding. She's quite regretful of. Should she pass, or should she be an authentic self? Is something that she's continues to struggle with. So I think her accounts of the impact of this othering discourse allows us to see that she's on a journey where there's a legitimate sense of belonging at some point, an authentic self is to be achieved. And it's interesting what you were saying earlier with Connor's work about how important an authentic self. And I think one of the things that to focus on here is an authentic self is crucial in senses of belonging. And also inclusion to disentangle with this very complicated, fraught journey around belonging. So this means for her, this constitution of the embodied academic must be contested. There's a bit of an act of rebellion and resisted. And so she says that she wants to embody now social class markers. So she says later on, she may dress more working class. And she talks about how she spent her first pay packet years ago on Bowden, in Bowden clothing. I don't know if everybody knows that, but it's a clothing company that's associated with very middle class kind of notions of dress, and she spent her first wage packet there trying to fit in, and now she wears flowery dresses and punky gear, etc. This is an act of rebellion and resistance on her part, as she's entangled with this drive to be authentic, but also try to avoid stigma. I think it's important, though, because as Franz Fanon always argued, politics of resistance need to be directed not only at social and economic locations, but tackle the deficient constructions of the self that are forced upon us. We must tackle those constructions of the self, and people must be given tools, I think, to be able to do that. And Therese just gives a little taste about perhaps there may be a little bit of hope and resistance within some of this data. So just to sum up then, as we previously found, and Taylor and Breeze too, there is a discourse that draws on a deficient, idealised academic self, and it constructs belonging as people's responsibility, and unbelonging as caused by our own internal complex or syndrome. But this current research revisits that and applies this second stage to ensure a kind of activist articulation of personal voices. How these constructions hit and bruise us, how they create shame and fear of being found out. So I hope that I can convince you that by using an approach that always focuses voice within broader systems of ideology, we can see how, for instance, othering kind of takes our pain but makes it ours to solve. So this pain that's produced socially makes it ours to solve through discourses such as the such as, for instance, a lack of belonging around imposter syndrome. They create shame of being working class and frustrations with ourselves to seeking to mask and fit in and conceal our family and be not authentically ourselves. So while we've got these hierarchies of class and embodied academics, untroubled largely, I must say, through the data, I think Therese and another few people we spoke to do reveal a kind of open resistance to this imposition of this self and the requirement to perform it in particular ways. So really, I just wanted to sort of give you some ideas about how we can start to really tackle the negotiation of the self, the sort of day-to-day grinding negotiation of who we are within systems that seek perhaps to oppress us in particular ways, and how there perhaps is some hope through that, but how ideology does hit us and does come inside of us and out of us, and we can see that kind of pain, guilt and shame within some of these, some of the eye poems that I showed today. I hope I managed to persuade you of that anyway, and it's important to use methods that identify discourse, but also how we've got voiced accounts of them. These are just a few references to my work, just in case you wanted to look. But thank you for listening anyway, and I suppose if anybody's got any questions, I hope that weren't too boring and academic, and I got some interesting points over.
Brigitte, I could just keep you here until midnight probably, because there's so much of that I think maps onto discussions that we have had as a collective, and also just I suppose frustrations that I've experienced personally just moving through kind of academic spaces and professional.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things there that really stuck out to me. One of which is around imposter syndrome. We had done a thematic analysis on like some of the themes from our webinars over the last year or so, and one of the themes was imposter syndrome. You know, people just feel I don't belong here, and that either being an internal felt sense, or be it that being communicated often by people criticizing language or clothes or diet, like can't believe you eat that, and we presented our findings a couple of months ago at the Working Class Academics Conference, and some of the kind of feedback that we had was around exactly your point.
I can still see the screen. Yes, sorry, I'll shut it off. Thank you. I've done that with teaching and shown people my emails and all sorts, so thank you for that.
But it's just such an important point, to, I suppose, as you're saying, to recognize that discomfort of feeling like an imposter, but recognizing, I suppose, that we do have that it's not coming from within. It is rarely an internal deficiency. It's more often a reflection of the systems that we're in, and I think that's just such an important point to get across.
I agree, and I think that the history of imposter syndrome through clinical psychology and practice is that it is an internal complex. It is something that you fix internally, and I think this data really is just strongly argue this is coming out onto us, but then we're made to feel responsible for it in some way, that it's sort of weaponized in that way, and it's about fighting and contesting that a little bit. So I'd always be a bit critical of imposter syndrome unless we're really positioning it on an organisational level.
Yeah,
we're taking it out of us into.
I think that's it exactly. It's framed because it's thrown around. I mean, obviously it's thrown around in lots of different contexts, but
Yes.
within clinical psychology, there's a lot of like, oh, I feel like a bit of an imposter. And I suppose it's to recognize that you can feel that discomfort and feel that maybe feeling a wee bit out of place, but it's there's a systemic role in that's causing that. It isn't about inherent lack.
Yeah.
It's often coming from the outside in.
Yes, of course. But also, I mean, some of our early data that were published in the 2021 showed that actually it can be an act of solidarity saying you've got imposter syndrome, because we found that what participants did, they told each other, I feel like I've got imposter syndrome. And that's how they connected to other working class people who might otherwise be silent. So they use the discourse of the syndrome to actually form collective action. So I don't think it's all bad. I just think we need to be wary of positioning it individually.
I think that's it. I think it can take on a wee bit of a life of its own, and if not used mindfully, I suppose it can become a bit of a proxy for other stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to mention was, I suppose we have had a couple of interesting comments and feedback about our work over the last wee while, and one of those things has been, well, none of you are working class anymore because you're all like
right.
professionals. Yes. And I suppose that really grinds my gears personally, but I've never really had an eloquent kind of comeback for that yet.
Right.
And I was actually, just as a bit of a plug, I was reading your book, the critical social class, and there's a comment in that about the move away from kind of deprivation, maybe to being about consumption, and debt being a big focus of that. Just that we're often, as aspiring psychologists in particular, we're often expected to work for free or to give up our time for different things, and just recognizing that as being a really significant factor. That people can't always afford to do that, and just the nature of how that relationship continues even post qualification.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two levels actually to that. I really swiftly back that one back if someone says that to me. And to be honest, it's usually a middle class person.
Yeah. And
it is usually a middle class person. And I just think if I even pretended to middle class, you wouldn't have me in your bloody gang anyway. What kind of game are you playing here? I think the fact of the matter is the structural inequalities for people from working class backgrounds. It's much more common for people to disperse their income beyond their immediate family. That is really common within working class backgrounds. It's much more likely that we would need to take on debt, even though we're really debt aversive, which creates all sorts of guilt and shame that might not be associated with debt. It's much more likely we can't move away from home. Well, we don't want to, because we see our communities and our family structure to be the thing that keeps us here and surviving. And so this notion you might move to the other side of the country or the world to pursue your career and leave all that behind is not open. It's a cultural and structural inequality. And secondly, classism is alive and well in nearly all working class organisations. And the impact is quite horrific, really, when you look at some of the examples of it. So you might say that I'm middle class, or whoever makes that comment to me, but I'm not treated as such, and I know that. I mean, I'm marked by my class. As soon as so many people find out, I'm a traditional Thatcher's 80s single mum. My child's 36 years old, my eldest. So much people find that about me, So and I just think that I think it's takes you on an interesting detour from class division, and we come across it over and over again. But that would be my response. We're structurally disadvantaged, and also we face discrimination on a level that's largely unaccounted for in the statistics.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Celine, I'm just wondering, have there been any kind of questions or feedback or anything for Rashida while we have her here?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to say a massive thank you to Bridget. I found that really, really empowering to hear the poems. I think putting them into kind of like almost a creative format like that is really interesting in academia, because you don't always share kind of creative outputs like that. So I found that personally really interesting. There's been quite a few comments about that kind of biculturalism and how people are almost not working class enough for their family at home now, and then too working class for their colleagues at work.
Yeah.
So that's being echoed a lot in kind of the chat and stuff. And I just had a question, if that's okay. So I know you said that class is not included in the Equality Act yet.
No.
And this means that you're like kind of not collecting data on this. I have seen quite a bit of stuff, because I'm interested in this in my research as well, around class not being included because it's quite hard to measure. So I wondered whether you had like any ideas around that.
So we were part of a group of psychologists called BSUPE, which are working on policy implications for social class, and we're working with the Equality Act review to try and inject there's a bits and bob of research on class across psychology. It's a bit woeful, to be honest, but it is there. So we're drawing that empirical research to inform the equality review as an inclusion, but we knew straight away they would come back with the issue of measurement. So we've been working with a number of different trusts and local councils to come up with a number of measures. We think there'll be different measures for different purposes. And we don't think there's a one and only measure to capture class or social inequality based on economic status. We've got a social economic status measure, it's being used, but we know that doesn't capture class. It wouldn't capture what we were just talking about, for instance. And also, I always think about those lottery winners when it first came out, and all these working class people winning all that money. And then they were like moving to all these posh islands. You know, they got all the money, they got the social economic status, but the stigma that they faced was horrific. You know, like all the ruffians are coming in. I used to think it was great. But that's a brilliant example. Our social economic status doesn't capture class. So, and I think also you might need an identity-based one. So, and it's the problem with class is it's so embarrassing that people don't usually mention it. They mention it by proxy or other. So they'll talk about them up there or them scruffy ones down the street. So often a qualitative kind of analysis is required. So we've got a number of measures, 4 different types of measures that could be used in different contexts, as well as concrete organisational level ones to make sure they're getting screened properly and captured. And what we're doing now is just put some money into the Joseph Rowntree funding bid together, hopefully for Joseph Rowntree, to actually try and pilot those measures in local councils and organisational means of using them to see if they work, and if not, can we make them work? Because we know that if we get anywhere, this quality review, and the door is open now. I've never seen it like this. It's so open in generations. Mainly because the government are talking about levelling up, and whether we think they care about that or not is a different thing. But they're going to say, right, where are the measures? And if we're not ready, it's just going to be another reason to do it. So we are working on it. It's not simple, and we can't pretend we're going to come up with it one all. But we think it's context dependent on what we're trying to measure and what we get at that time. That's just so succinct as I can say it, sorry.
No, that's amazing. I haven't kind of thought about it being context dependent as well, because I've seen the stuff the civil service put out about it kind of being like static and being relatable and like applicable to everyone, but I hadn't thought about changing it. I wonder to what extent as well you could just ask people to self-define, because a lot of other protected characteristics you self-define. It seems like we're focusing a lot on like, oh, you know, are you allowed to call yourself working class? It's almost like everyone wants to look down on the working class, yet if you claim to be working class, it's like, oh, well, prove it, you know. So I wonder how much you could actually just ask people to self-identify and what like settings you'd be able to do that in.
Well, we do that in our research. We use self-identification. We also look at the transcripts to look at positioning of the self to others, so we can look at class discourse, because it's never named as it is. We do that, and so in research that would work. I think some of the best measures are that could be used at organisational level. You can look at that questionnaire at the end. It captures, you know, if they've managed to capture gender identity, which they have now on the census, which was a remarkable piece of work. because that is so difficult to capture, gender identity. I think we can capture something for the purpose of something like a census. Do you know what I mean? That goes beyond social economic status. There's some tried and tested traditions, such as parents' income's one of them, postcode data. You probably can combine them all, and some people do for those purposes. We just need to capture it. And if there's a legal, we've got a legal reason to do it, then organisations will all of a sudden start to do it, and we can do class audits, and the same as we do gender audits through Athena Swan, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I found this recently in my research. Actually, social status or class data is just not available because because it's such kind of a Pandora's box to open. People almost just don't go there at the moment.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about it, to be honest. They don't want to talk about it. The amount of times I give talks and the room is really, really quiet for a period of time when I talk about the embarrassment in class. It was really, really quiet, and you can just feel the discomfort in the room. That's why a lot of practitioners don't tackle it head on in their practice. It's just and the British are terrible for it, absolutely terrible. We will produce the class system, but yeah.
I'm just noticing there's Catherine has her hand up. I'm just wondering if Catherine, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Really support that call for kind of accurate and robust and systematic data collection on these things. One question for Bridget, and then I guess like a more general one, because I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm aspiring. So in your research, Bridget, did you, were your participants, did they talk about where they kind of experienced these feelings from, and if it was at any particular level, either within, for example, was it within amongst other clinical psychologists at their level, or was it among the NHS? Was it senior managers? I'm just thinking, like, just to kind of pad out some of that chill of where that experience came from. And then my more kind of general point was just, do clinical psychologists have a trade union? I know there's a professional body, but you've obviously talked quite rightly about collective power and all these kind of discussions. So that was my other question. Thank you.
Well, this is a great bit of activism that you guys got going here with this seminar. It's absolutely brilliant. That this is how you bond together and get your own little, rather than gentleman's club, you got your own working class club, you know. And let's do it, I'd say. My participants were academics, though some of them were practitioners, but they were mostly academics. The women academics, they talked about an whole number of different experiences of classism. From when they first got the job, they went to meet everybody in a restaurant, and then when they got there, the people who were meeting thought they were a waitress and asked them where they were seated, etc. To people commenting directly on the clothes, the way they looked, the hair, the accent, the language, and it was really directly and relational to almost everyone that they worked with. As I said, a lot of them said that they were more comfortable with the support staff in academia. That's the student support staff who were overwhelmingly working class, and that's where they hung out in the end. It was systematic almost at every level, unfortunately. I'd like to be more cheery about it, but that was the case.
I think your point about trade unions, Catherine, as far as I know, there isn't a psychologist trade union of its own. I know a lot of people use like Unite or Unison, but we don't have one of our own, I don't think. As far as I know, I'm happy to be corrected on that. Ruda, do you have a question?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Well, I'm only a second-year student and I'm doing a forensic psychology, so nothing to do with clinical psychology. But I feel this because I'm also a foreigner, single mom, working class all over. But then I think if we would, when we apply, for example, for a job, and we tick all the boxes and say, oh, she's a proper working class, but without this ticking the boxes, I would actually come across different, you know, as better, because then people can get the bias or prejudice, oh, she's a working class single mom, whatever other things, you know. But if I can hide it, if I don't need to show it, I have a very high, for example, academic like grades and everything, so I don't fit with all the working class boxes, you know, I don't tick them all. But if I need to fill up the form, I maybe it can make it worse for me. I'm sorry, I try to think very fast English, but I hope you understand the question. So, you know, we can get this other side. It might harm some people, because I'm lucky enough, I get often to say, oh, it's easy for you, or middle class. I'm so much working class, but I just lucky and I use it. But, you know, if I need to tick the box and say, oh, she's working class and we don't want her here.
Well, I think I was referring to collecting demographics like we do race and gender and disability on equality forms that are held separately and anonymously from the data, rather than actually collecting it individually, which is obviously, you're quite right, might lead to more bias, often for working class people. If you look at the CV, they wouldn't know that they were working class. We do quite well sometimes, go to some quite good universities, survive well, etc. So I think you're right, and I think there is an argument that passing or striving to pass is a practice of survival for a lot of working class people, and it certainly throws up an internal battle around authenticity. I don't think it's straightforward, but it's a practice of survival, and that's exactly what it is. So I'm not discouraging people from doing that.
There was something really interesting, I think, about I think Connor touched on this, about, you know, almost in some situations having to wait until you have enough capital or privilege, whatever, to shed the camouflage, and then kind of come back and own your working class identity, because at certain points it maybe doesn't feel safe enough to do that. And I think what's been really interesting from this kind of the ClassClin thing, obviously we all started kind of from within clinical psychology, but it's really broadened out, and so much of that has touched on exactly what Ruth has just described. That thing, you know, when is it safe for me to disclose that I am a working class person? And I know, like, the clinical psychology application process is ridiculous, like it's so competitive, and there's a huge issue there around how much do I disclose on my on my personal statement, how much do I share, and I think that's something that really kind of Ruth is touching on there, just that kind of, when is it safe? And I think at the moment, in some situations, it's just not. It definitely feels a bit risky.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been able to hide mine, really, for a whole number of different reasons. Not because I've not tried, because I agree with you. In some situations, it was certainly more safer to do so. But some of the participants we talked to spent a lot of time flattening their accent, buying new clothes, not referring to certain parts of the family background, which council estate they came from, even like having slightly fictitious family lives. I mean, it was quite a big piece of work for them to do, to but that had served them well. They got promoted, they were able to get on and get merit for the things they could actually do. It's especially difficult for Black working class people. So a lot of my participants were people of colour, women of colour as well. That seemed to just strike another layer of inequality on the top of everything else, because there's one thing that's blatant and there's one thing that perhaps they can hide, so they might be much more likely to hide the thing they can.
Absolutely, and you bring up a brilliant point there, just about there's privilege in being able to hide. Absolutely, and I think that we did a webinar, I think probably about this time last year, on like visible and invisible difference, and for people with disability, where they may need like additional reasonable adjustments or anything like that. Just the kind of the horror that they felt having to bring that up, and kind of the shame around that, especially when maybe they felt outsiders within a system already. Just really, really challenging. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm gonna I think there's one hand up. Catherine, I don't know if your hand is still up or if it's up again.
They've got a Ponzi name for that. Is it legacy hand or something?
Or Dawn Reeves. Dawn, do you have something if you want to add something?
Yeah, I was curious as to when you speak about othering, so you're not belonging to the new group that you're in, so to speak. I'm curious whether it came up about the idea that you don't belong to the group that you came from anymore, and how they negotiate that, and how they work through that, and related to that point, whether anything came out about, in a sense, I don't know if this would be the right way to put it, but like a working class radar, that you kind of know when somebody else around you is working class, and you seem to levitate towards each other, and how that had an impact. And one more point, I totally went through the Bowden experience, but it took me a little bit longer to get there. It was like 25 years into my career before I realized Bowden, I would try the Bowden experience, but it had to be in the sales. So that was the working class aspect. But yeah, those 2 points I'd be interested to know.
Well, we didn't look at the crisis of identity between past and future, which is what you're getting at there, but there's a lot of work on that. And it's nearly all feminist work as well. One of the reasons why I've drawn so much feminist work within class is that feminism has been doing class for a long time within psychology. So Valerie Welkerdime's work, for instance, is really good at the kind of agony, the in-between place that we're placing sometimes. So I didn't necessarily look at that, so I can't talk to that from my research. Although your story about the Bowden thing didn't make me laugh out loud. I sort of had a wooden bead stage, so I'm feeling it.
Does that answer your question, Don? Is that kind of?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. There, I mean, it's not my area of expertise at all, but something I've mentioned a couple of times has been that Patricia Hill Collins, like the idea of the outsider within, you leaving behind the environment that you grew up in, kind of transcending class in whatever way, and then not really feeling part of either. Just kind of sitting.
Get stories with people of colour really similar, and a lot of this theorising does come from Black feminist work, actually, where they're sort of accused of leaving the Black roots at the same time as being excluded for being too Black, and I think there's a lot of echoes over in class too.
Absolutely. Bridget, thank you so much. That's really
okay.
Interesting.
Thank you for having me. You've been absolutely lovely audience.
No, it's been lovely. It's been really, really nice. I think what we're going to do now is.
I think you've accidentally pressed your mute button.
Sorry. If we take a wee break and come back in about 10 minutes, just after 9 o'clock, and then we have Kevin, who's going to do our last little bit. So if we take a little break, and I'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
folks, I'm just going to bring us all back, if possible, if you are there. And our final presenter for this evening is Kevin Acott. Now, might it be? Are you there, Kevin? Hi, Kevin. How are you doing?
Hiya.
Good, good, good. Are you happy just to introduce yourself, Kevin, and close us off for this evening?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, yeah.
Super.
Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah. Sounds grand.
Brilliant. So, yeah, I was just thinking it's really difficult following two really good presentations, because there's so much stuff there that overlaps, and there's so much stuff there that I wish I had included in mine. And one of those I was just thinking is the sort of issue of authenticity. And I'm not sure if you can see that. My mug. It's a Spurs mug, and it says "Dad" on it. And these are two of the I guess key parts of my identity. But if I was completely honest with you, I just had chamomile and honey tea, and that issue of shifting from class to class, I think it's sort of illustrated by having chamomile and honey tea anyway. Yeah, so my name's Kevin Acott. I've already started rambling. I'm senior lecturer in mental health nursing at London South Bank University. I'm a mental health nurse. I'm a Spurs fan, and I'm a father. I thought it was interesting that Bridget described herself as an academic, and I can't. I do sometimes, but I find that quite tricky. There's something about being in nursing academia that suggests that you're not really an academic. You're not really quite a proper academic. There's also something about being a mental health nurse that suggests you're not really a proper nurse either. And some of these sort of conflicts, some of these tensions, I just wanted to sort of look at now. I'm going to look at sort of 4 or 5 different areas and hopefully bring them all together. I realized as I was preparing this that it just could become a massive sort of piece of work, and I could probably talk for about 3 or 4 hours, but I just want to look at some of the key issues here around social class and around mental health nursing in particular. And I want to sort of make reference to my experience, which is not necessarily typical, although I think I certainly share some things in common with a lot of other mental health nurses, particularly in my generation. I think things are changing, but particularly those of us who are slightly older than everyone else in mental health nursing. I think we have particular sort of experiences. I grew up on, what I've written here is, I grew up on the edge of London in Enfield. I don't know if anyone knows Enfield, but it's definitely on the edge of London. No one's quite sure whether it's London or not, which is interesting. Again, I think there's one of these tensions about, am I a Londoner? I don't know. My sister, once in passing, was sitting with my my late mum. I think it was a Christmas, and my sister just in passing said, well, growing up working class like we did, and my mum was appalled at the suggestion that we were working class. She felt that people over the other side of Baker Street, they were working class. Those of us on our side of Baker Street weren't. And so this is, I guess sort of my story feels one of sort of belonging and not belonging. I like that word unbelonging that Bridget used. I think there's a real sense of unbelonging individually and within a profession that is just sort of riven with unbelonging in some ways. So I've forgotten where I was going to go. I think the next thing I've got written down here is, so why am I sitting here at all? And I think it's because I'm trying to make sense of, I'm pretty near the end of my career now. I hope I'm in my last job, if that makes sense, in academia, working at London South Bank. And I've been trying to make sense of the last 18 months. I've had a couple of sort of cancer scares personally, been through, far easier than many people, but I've been through sort of the tensions and the pressures and the threats of COVID. And I guess mortality has sort of been really sharpened by everything that's happened for me over the last 18 months. And one of the things I've been doing is just trying to make sense of my career, make sense of what I'm doing, make sense of who I am. And this sort of, the opportunity to give this lecture, I guess, sort of helped, came at a good time, and and I'm trying to make it, I guess, help me. I'm trying to use it therapeutically in a way as well as hopefully giving something to you. And I wanted to sort of start, although I know I'm about 5 minutes in, with a quote from Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, "It's necessary to overturn all relations in which man is a degraded, a subjugated, an abandoned, or a contemptible being." And for me, that's what we should be doing in mental health care generally. That we're working often with people who are seen as degraded, as subjugated, as abandoned, as contemptible. But in a way, the key phrase for me there is that it's necessary to overturn those relations. And I think one of the arguments I want to make is that we don't, particularly in mental health nursing. We less and less attempt to overturn those relations that lead to subjugation, that lead to degradation. We don't challenge the relations. We accept that those social things that are happening outside mental health nursing, outside the direct work that we do with people, we just accept those and we try and help people cope with them, but we don't challenge them. And that's one of the things that I really want to, I guess to sort of just highlight and to try and make sense of. So I'm just sort of thinking a little bit about my my background. I started mental health nursing partly because I couldn't think of anything else to do, and partly because the sister of my then girlfriend told me I needed to sort of basically do something with my life because I wasn't good enough for her sister, and find myself a career and do something. So I sort of drifted, and I started at Broadmoor. And for those of you who don't know, Broadmoor was then termed a special hospital. Broadmoor was sort of still very similar to the old asylums in that it was pretty much like the local factory. So people worked there whose fathers had worked there, whose grandfathers had worked there. The workforce then was a white working class male workforce. And it was a workforce that was often incredibly abusive towards patients. And as one of these, I think one of the sort of core elements that I've always been uncomfortable with in mental health nursing is that what has happened is that one part of the working class has essentially oppressed and abused another part of the working class. And that raises all sorts of questions, I think, that we need to challenge, and I think we're still trying to challenge sometimes. A few things happened to me. I was saying to someone today, I was working on an acute mental health ward, and the ward sister came up to me, and she was really pleased, and she said to me, something brilliant just happened. The psychiatrist just said you, i.e. me, that you're really clever for a psychiatric nurse. And I remember thinking, it was almost a point where I thought I just want to walk away. What do you mean really clever for a psychiatric nurse? In some ways he was being more honest than a lot of psychiatrists, and maybe some psychologists would have been. That there's a sense in which mental health nurses are not as bright, not as academic as other professions. And one of the really interesting things for me is that we play into that, or traditionally we've played into that. We make a virtue of being non-academic, of being anti-intellectual. Again, it's led to all sorts of tensions for me. And again, I think for a a lot of colleagues is that you have this determinedly anti-intellectual profession that moved into the universities sort of 15, 20 years ago, slightly reluctantly and not very convincingly. I think I was always sort of on the I think there are two sort of strands to mental health nursing, to the history of mental health nursing. One is a controlling, managing, restricting, restraining strand, and the other, which feels like a strand that's sort of almost been lost, but not quite. And I think that's really important, the not quite. The other strand is one that's radical, that actually says we need to do more than whatever we're doing individually with service users, with patients, with clients. That we need to actually look at the roots of what we're terming mental health problems. We need to do something socially. We need to be politically active. There is a strand, a strong strand in mental health nursing that's that is radical, that is traditionally left-wing, that's traditionally socialist. My fear, and I think again the fear of some of my colleagues, is that that's disappearing. And paradoxically, maybe I think it's disappeared because we've moved into universities. That the university in some ways has actually increased an anti-academic, anti-intellectual sort of way of being in mental health nursing. So I think I don't want to go into too much detail really about my career, but I did DBT, just DBT training. I worked a lot with people who self-harm, who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and I think those sort of dialectical ideas have become really important to me. And I think again, I would want us as a profession, mental health nurses, to try and reclaim some of those ideas. The idea that within two apparent poles, actually there's some truth in both, that we can actually bring together a sort of synthesis. And what I'd like to do, I think, is ideally that I would like the profession to synthesize some of those apparent oppositions between being a sort of profession that is about social control, or being a profession that's about facilitating and empowering people's growth and development. I think it's possible to bring those two things together in a way that actually ultimately is empowering to people, but it's difficult. It's really difficult. I sort of stumbled across Stuart Hall's work. I stumbled across a lot of sort of left-wing theorist work, Paulo Freire, Althusser, and I've sort of incorporated them. I've done it quite, in my teaching, I've done it quite subtly. Or I think I've done it subtly. I'm not sure whether students or colleagues would agree, but it's always felt that actually mental health nurse education is not particularly open to anymore to more radical ideas. It used to be, but much less so now. But I've started. Interestingly, I think one of the things that's happened to me is that I feel like, as I've got older and as I'm heading towards the end of my career, I feel like I've become more radical, in a way, more left-wing, more challenging of the status quo. And I'm not sure that's the way it's meant to be, but it's how it feels. And I think COVID and everything that's happened over the last 18 months has sort of been part of that. Freire said, who's a Brazilian sort of Marxist educator, said that neutral education can't in fact exist. It's fundamental for us to know that when we work on the content of an educational curriculum, when we discuss methods and processes, when we plan, when we draw up policies, we are always engaged in political acts. And again, this is something that I think I'd forgotten this stuff. I'd let all of these ideas sort of drift over the last sort of 10, 15 years, and they've come back to me and increasingly feel important, that whatever we do educationally, in whatever sphere, because we're all educators in different ways in different parts of our lives. We are always engaged in political acts, and I think it's really important that we sort of take that on board. And I think particularly for my profession, that feels like it's engaged or sort of says so often that it's engaged in a neutral act, and we're not engaged in neutral acts. We're not just teaching people to carry out particular tasks. Ideally, we're not. What we're trying to do is actually ultimately affect people positively, so they can affect other people positively, so we can actually improve society as a whole. So, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here, but I was just thinking about the mention of trade unions. When I started, it's not totally true actually. When I started at Broadmoor, the majority of people, nurses, were members of the Prison Officers Association, which tells you something about how Broadmoor was in those days. But the first sort of acute units, non-special hospitals I worked in, the majority of nurses there were members of the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union. And I think that again suggests where mental health nursing partly came from. It came from a solid, radical working class sort of roots. And those were still there in the 80s and 90s. A lot of those roots were still there. I had a couple of quotes, because one of the things I've realized, I think, again, increasingly, is how if we disconnect from our history, whether that's if psychology disconnects from its own history, psychiatry disconnects from its history, mental health nursing disconnects, then we're liable to just fall down this sort of neutral, apparently neutral rabbit hole and not actually work for the benefit of the people we should be working for. And as his historian, mental health nursing historian, Niall McCabe, and he talked about the underling status of nursing and how that began to change after the Second World War, partly due to the therapeutic community model, but that actually things didn't change as much as they could have done. And he said, not least because nurses were reluctant to relinquish control over patients. And we come back then to something that, again, I don't think we always deal with very well. And I would say, actually, in the last few years, we've gone backwards, which is the management of patients elevates, on one level, elevates mental health nurses and makes them feel more powerful and makes them feel, I guess, more in control, more autonomous, more important. And so again, we have that split, that tension within, I guess, within a broader group of working class people. He also said, Niall McCabe also said, that the historical development of mental health care is a story almost exclusively written by doctors. And I think that's largely true. Nurses have made, as he said, a minimal contribution to that history. And I guess that maybe in some ways one of the things I want to do, and some colleagues want to do, is actually sort of develop our contribution to our own history. Because I think contributing to the history of mental health nursing is contributing to working class history. It's about empowering, it's about sort of seeing things as, helping us see things as they really are, which is that we're at a particular point historically, and we've come to be at this point for a number of reasons. Because of power issues, because of threat issues, because of meaning, all of those things have sort of come together at this moment in time for reasons, and we can learn from those reasons, and we can change the future in some ways. I mentioned person-centered working. I'm guessing, I have no idea how long I've gone on. I'm really sorry, but I just want to mention a couple of things. Person-centered working. Why do I have a problem with person-centeredness? I think I have a problem because it's ahistorical. Often it doesn't contextualize people. It says we essentially must be compassionate, we must be empathic, we must be congruent, we must be nice and kind. But it doesn't see people necessarily within context. I think I would actually divide person-centered approaches or client-centered approaches into sort of vague client-centered approaches, which is what mental health nursing essentially has taken on board. And those are the very specific and contextualized. I think it's possible to take a socialist approach to person-centered working, but that's by synthesizing these two different things together. So mental health nursing, nursing generally actually talks about the therapeutic relationship without ever defining what it is. It talks about empathy, it talks about empowerment, it talks about facilitation, and rarely do we actually look at what the challenges are to those things. We just say you should. We sort of say to students, be compassionate, but we don't ask them to really understand their power. We don't ask them to understand the threats that people are facing, the trauma that people have experienced. We just say, be compassionate. And we don't always ask students themselves what they have experienced and what trauma they've experienced. And we increasingly have a demographic within mental health nurse education of people who have been traumatized in different ways. And we're not really yet recognizing that or doing very much about that. I'm going to sort of bring this to an end. I'm sort of guessing I'm quite near the end. I guess I'm sort of. It would be great if we've got time to just sort of ask you what you feel. I guess particularly non-nurses, what you feel about mental health nurses and their role. Someone mentioned decolonizing the curriculum. I think one big part of that is about what should be the protected characteristic of social class. We need to look at mental health nurse training and actually all mental care work training in terms of class as well as in terms of ethnicity, culture, sexuality, and everything else. So I'm gonna finish off with I went to a school. Another part of my the sort of constant tension about not quite knowing where I stand and who I am or what I'm doing is that I went from my working class, but not as working class as the bit across the road, sort of community, and I went to a grammar school and became sort of middle class really for those 7 years, sort of, but not really comfortably. And the friends I still have, and I do have quite a number of friends that I still have quite good connections with from that school, were all from working class backgrounds. So we sort of formed this group of people who went on through life, and sort of 40 odd years later, we're still friends. But one of the things that we have in common is that class background pre the grammar school, pre the becoming middle class. One of the people who, a few famous people went to my grammar school. The one who I think should be most famous, and he's never mentioned in any history of our school, because he was an anarchist and a very, very active anarchist in all sorts of ways. There's a man called Albert Meltzer. And I just wanted to finish with a quote from him. I didn't even know, while I was at school, I'd never even heard of him. It's only fairly recently that I've heard of him. He died in the 80s. He was very, very active. He was involved as a very young man at Cable Street. He was involved in all sorts of sort of left-wing activity, including attempts to assassinate Franco and all sorts of things. But he said, the histories of whole peoples were wiped out for precisely the same reason that the history of the working class movement in recent times is wiped out. It does not suit the conquerors for it to be known, because traditions keep alive the spirit of revolt. And I suppose I was thinking as I read that, that's something I wish I could do. is to keep alive the spirit of revolt within mental health nursing, because it is still there. I think that spirit of revolt is clearly, from what everyone's been saying today, it's there in other professions as well. And I think if we can find ways to link together, you know, and give voice and energy to that spirit of revolt, then we can do something really, really powerful. And that's it, really. I haven't done at all what I intended to do, but hopefully that's been interesting. So, thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much. You know, I think you and Connor could probably go away and produce something publishable just between the content of your two talks this evening. I think you're right. You know, I mean, I think a lot of what you've spoken about. First of all, it's great to have representation from another profession within mental health here, and that's kind of what we always envisaged, is that this kind of ClassClin thing would evolve and kind of grow legs outside of just psychology. I think a lot of what you've spoken about maps really lovely onto what Connor's spoken about with regard to the power threat meaning framework. Is really, really interesting. And I think you're right. I think there's often a bit of division between the professions, and it's interesting it's interesting, I suppose, to think who is working really hard to kind of understand and remedy that, and who isn't arsed, because there's definitely some people that division benefits. Also fantastic to start with a quote from Marx. It's just amazing. I don't know if you know, if you've ever heard of cognitive analytic therapy, but it's kind of this way of like mapping out, you know, like relational kind of themes, and it just something you spoke about was just this kind of, you know, I've kind of done this kind of reciprocal roles. So it's a bit shit, but just that idea of, you talked a bit about kind of the controlling the controlled, you know, the aspects of the profession that feel quite controlling, and in return what happens then is the professionals feel controlled, but patients feel controlled and under quite a bit of scrutiny as well. And it's interesting how that is kind of reciprocated in the two camps. And also then just you spoke then about moving to a model of empowerment, you know, that working to empower people, to empower professionals within mental health. And I think that's probably something that we're all working towards, you know, is ideally we're looking to remove kind of that paternalistic approach to distress, and move a bit more towards empowering people to understand themselves, understand their circumstances, and for them to kind of move through difficulty without them being so heavily scrutinized that they end up powerless. And again, I think that maps so well onto that kind of power threat meaning framework idea of like, where is power operating in your life? I think that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Celine, I just wondered if there was any kind of feedback or questions for Kevin just from the chat.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a really interesting comment in the chat that from Sue that says mental health nurses do a really valuable job under very difficult circumstances, but I was surprised to hear that trauma is not being addressed, and this is concerning and potentially harmful for the practitioner and possibly the patient. I think this touches on what Ben just said about their obviously being the nurses themselves are feeling that there's power at play, and that's being passed on to the patients. So from like a psychologist point of view, I was just wondering whether there's anything, you know, that you would suggest that would make nurses feel more empowered so they can relinquish kind of some of that power that they hold over patients, and whether that kind of relinquishing of power is important to have a good therapeutic relationship in nursing.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question. I mean, I think first of all, there is movement now, I think, within most universities towards talking about trauma-informed care, towards helping students become aware of the core of trauma, you know, within almost every sort of mental health problem. Sorry, what was the second thing you said? Because I was.
No, that's okay. I said, do you think that it's important to relinquish like the power that you have with patients in order to have a therapeutic relationship? Or do you think there is something about nursing where it's kind of, because it's very much patient and you know, nurse, rather than, I know in psychology we use lots of different words to describe what a patient is, but it's very medicalized in nursing. So do you think that power is an important part of that?
I'm hoping my boss isn't here. She said she might turn up. I would say, if I was being completely honest, we'd get rid of the profession of mental health nursing. That would be my sort of radical answer to what you're saying, because the existence of nurses actually empowers the medical model, if that makes sense, because we have doctors, nurses, and actually it's hard to move away from a medical model when you have people called nurses who are carrying out sort of a lot of activities that are actually in parallel and very similar to those that are carried out in physical healthcare settings. I still think the best professionals I've ever worked with, and I would say this, and the ones who have been most effective have been mental health nurses. But I think those people could still be as effective if they weren't part of that profession. So I guess ultimately that would be my sort of dream. It's not going to happen for 20, 30 years, maybe, if it does at all. But I think one way away from the medical dominance of mental health care is actually, because I think it's more likely you can withdraw nurses from it than withdrawing doctors from it. That ultimately would be about doing that. Even just a change of name. I think it's happening. I don't think it's happening for the right reasons, but I think we're having less trained, less qualified, less well-paid, members of staff coming in. So the numbers of actual nurses, it's starting to reduce, but I'm not sure that's quite the answer. So I think, and I think nurses still need to develop more self-confidence in who they are and in their own importance, and the significance of having those therapeutic relationships.
So do you think it's a little bit about like kind of separating the physical medical care that a nurse may do and then the emotional mental health care that a nurse may do, and separating those into like distinct roles?
Yeah, although I'm definitely in a minority on that one. I think it's almost like there's a pull the other in completely the other direction, really, that we merge the two. I think mental health nursing is held on to its separateness. There's so much pressure for that to, that's gradually collapsing, I think. But I'm not sure it means that it's then being replaced by emotional, whatever we would call that new group of people. I think the danger is that there's just then this vacuum left. So that the equivalent of mental health nurses do risk assessment, do care coordination, do particularly inpatient focused sort of work, but the more therapeutic day-to-day sort of, whatever you call it, sort of solution focused working, it doesn't happen at all, except from the smaller professions, the less well-resourced professions in some ways, like psychotherapy, psychology, OT. Yeah.
I think we just have a question from Olivia. Are you Olivia? Do you want to unmute?
Hi. Yeah. Sorry, just on what Kevin just said. I come from a psychiatric liaison background. I'm an assistant psychologist in psychiatric liaison, and what I've seen from our service is that nurses and psychologists and OTs working together is really, really helpful for patients in terms of establishing that therapeutic relationship and kind of getting rid of that power dynamic a little bit as well. Like our nurses feel very therapeutic in the way that they do their assessments and things like that. And I think that perhaps nurses and psychologists and OTs working together is a really, really helpful model, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm very conscious of having painted actually a really negative sort of my own profession, and I think there are so many examples of what you've just described, and I think it is important to hold on to to that when it works incredibly well, and mental health nurses are, an equal part of a really positive sort of team across the country.
There's definitely something, I think, Kevin, about I worked for a while within A&E and worked with some great mental health nurses who I think you're right at touching on the point around confidence and around maybe there's a role for professionals in that setting who do hold a bit more power and a bit more kind of privilege to talk in MDTs or whatever, to factor in or empower, again bringing it back to empowerment, around the reflections and insights that maybe a nurse has had with someone, and to I think from my perspective as a psychologist working in that sort of team, trying to include that information, that qualitative information in any kind of formulation would pull together or co-creating that as much as possible. But I think you're right. I think there's something just around who gets to speak up, who gets to not just implement the intervention, but who gets to input into what the intervention looks like as well. I think there's definitely something interesting there about, the politics between professions. Definitely.
I guess part of my feeling is that some of that's about social class. Some of that is actually that mental health nursing still has those roots, and it comes back to imposter syndrome. It comes back to a lot of the things we've talked about, that actually that sort of doctor up there and nurse down here stuff that's about class, it's about gender, but it's that's still there. So that lack of confidence, at least in part, is based in social class, I think, and traditionally has been.
Yeah, definitely. There's a book called The Unconscious at Work, and it's a psychodynamic book that talks a lot about that. There's a whole lot of different authors, some of whom are nursing scholars, but they speak about kind of the psychodynamics behind different professional roles within mental health, and there's a chapter on nursing that's really, really interesting, and I think speaks to a lot of that kind of what's spoken, what's not spoken. And a lot of that maps on to exactly as you said, like some of the themes that was touched on this evening. It was really, really interesting, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
We'll maybe make room for one last wee question. Celine? Celine, do you want to just speak about rather than me?
Yeah, I'm conscious that I don't want to hog the last question if anyone else has one, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. It's a bit of an off-topic one from kind of the conversations we've been having, but I know from kind of the psych perspective and from looking at the clearinghouse data that the people that are accessing like the clinical doctorate, which is funded through the NHS, but is obviously a doctorate level qualification rather than an undergraduate level qualification, are largely middle class and white predominantly. I wondered whether, because nursing is funded, I don't think it is anymore, but it was funded at the undergraduate level and it was one of the only degrees that was funded and essentially free, whether that opened it up to kind of more working class people and whether they were more likely to pursue that than say pursue a psychology degree, or whether that wasn't your experience.
No, I mean, again, I think it's quite complicated, but the big demographic shift has been essentially that the majority in many universities, the majority of mental health nursing students are from African backgrounds, either first, second generation backgrounds. So it's a huge shift to when I was training, where essentially it was a white working class profession. It's not going to be in 5 to 10 years time. I think that's an opportunity. But I think it's something we're not really tackling. We're not really seeing as an opportunity. We're actually almost pretending it's the case. And so, yeah, I think I don't know where things will be in the future, but I think that shift in demographic could be a good one. I think in terms of class, I think the sort of interplay between class and ethnicity is starting to complicate. Almost everything that I've been talking about is being complicated by that, and will continue to be. And in part, I don't know where we're going to be. Again, I'm not sure whether I've answered your question or not.
No, that definitely makes sense. I just would kind of follow up with, what do you think is driving the kind of shift from it being a white working class profession to perhaps the more ethnically diverse applicants that you're getting?
I don't know. I think in some ways the closure of the old sort of model, that sort of the shift into the community, meant that the asylum being the fact the local factory is, obviously that ceased to exist. There was active recruitment, very active recruitment in the 70s and 80s in Mauritius, particularly in the Caribbean, and much more recently in Africa. I think there's a reluctance amongst, particularly, I did some research, just a little bit. It wasn't research. I did some audit at my last employer, and I asked for figures on how many white working class men there were in terms of students. Out of 300, I was told 2. 30 years ago, that would have been probably 298. There's all sorts of reasons for it. I think many of them economic, many of them that it seems to have lost its attraction to white working class boys. It's really, really not remotely a cool profession at all, and so there's a lot of sort of gender-based sort of opposition, I think, to the idea of being a nurse, which wasn't there before.
Yeah, definitely. I think we see that in psychology as well.
Yeah, I was just literally just going to say that. Yeah. There's definitely something around, the where does it go? Like, where can it take you? And I don't know. I think it's a really interesting area, like, ripe for research if anyone fancies doing it. But there's something about, where it used to be kind of a solid profession that you went into for life. I think, I mean, I'm just guessing, but I wonder if more people are kind of questioning, well, where's the progression? And I know definitely within psychology, there's a bottleneck getting onto training, and then I think there's a bit of a bottleneck about who progresses into the upper bands. And I imagine the same is maybe true within nursing a wee bit as well, just around that. Where do you specialize? Who gets to specialize? What are the more favored kind of areas to specialize in? It's really, really interesting. I have a good friend who I met while I was working in a hospital here. She's an oncology nurse, and she worked with Macmillan, and she's now just left the NHS to go and do a PhD. But it's interesting. Like, I've had conversations with her. Like, she's brilliant. Like, she's really, really, really switched on. Really interested in a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, Kevin. But it was interesting, just her perception of what re-entering education would be like, and like, was it for her? And she would consider herself, like a white working class woman. She's done her career, and she's now going into this new territory and going into, like, a big red brick university. And that's so interesting, just hear her talking about that transition, out of her career and into this big posh, environment. And it's just a really it's just fascinating how these themes are so pervasive, throughout professions and throughout lots of different situations. Guys, I'm just conscious of time. Thank you all again so much, Kevin. Thank you for contributing this evening. And if we do a talk, or if we do a webinar on service user experiences of class, I think that you might actually have quite an interesting perspective there to add, just from a kind of professional standpoint. I'm just going to share my screen and do like a little kind of roundup. So just thank you everyone for attending this evening. I think probably everyone will agree it's been really, really, really interesting. The Padlet is apparently on fire, so the link for that will be shared more widely kind of from tomorrow, but we'll close off access to add to it probably pretty soon. So if there's any few wee bits that you want to get in there beforehand, fire them on. Just want to thank all of our speakers. Thank everyone who's kind of contributed this evening with their questions and reflections. As I said earlier, you know, we are very much on Twitter. We are very online, and there's actually a link on Twitter to all of kind of our past webinars, different talks that we've done in places, some articles that we've been part of, including this very recent conversation on class that was in The Psychologist recently. It's also available online. Also want to just shout out quickly to Michelle Jameson. She's an academic psychologist. She was going to speak this evening, but unfortunately she wasn't able to attend. But I'm going to include a link to like some of her work, just if you're interested in having a wee nose at the kind of stuff that she does. I'm hoping that she'll be able to join us again in the future. We also have like a small working group of people who are interested in class and psychology, and there are people from different kind of professional backgrounds and disciplines as well involved in that. If you're interested in kind of joining in that working group and contributing to kind of the work that we're doing, either throw us a wee DM on Twitter, or you can email us through to classclin@gmail.com. And just on behalf of everyone in the ClassClin team, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I hope it's been enjoyable. I hope you find something to kind of take away from it. I certainly have found it really, really interesting, and thank you so much again to everyone who's taken part this evening. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you so much.